everybody. Welcome to Easel Live. Holy cow. I feel like every time I do this, I always say, I'm so excited to be here and teach you something. And all of that pales in comparison to how I feel right now because I have somebody sitting next to me. And that is super exciting. So some of you may remember back in December of last year, we had this thing on our website. We did like this 12 days of Christmas sale. And Zach Kaplan, our CEO at Inventables, was like, Mo, I really want you to do something unique and different. And I was like, oh boy, what do I do? And I was like, maybe we'll send off the opportunity to co-host Easel Live. Maybe that's something people are interested in. And I don't know if anybody else was interested in it, but Matt Mead, who works here at CPR Consulting in Chicago in the Willis Tower, which is where we are today, Matt Mead was interested in it. And he purchased the opportunity to be here, and his donation will go to the Laurie's Children's Hospital, which is fantastic. And now we're sitting here together many months later, super exciting. And we're going to teach you guys some basic furniture joinery. So Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, just so the audience kind of knows who you are?
Sure. So I'm a maker, love making things out of all sorts of materials. I started with CNC machines, primarily open source machines and open source hardware and open source software about 4 or 5 years ago. And then it's been a few years ago that I stumbled into Easel and Inventables and bought an X-Carve. We've got a Carvey here behind us and just really love it. Love doing lots of things on machines that have an X and a Y axis. So 3D printing, metal milling, embroidery, but love my X-Carve, love building things on the X-Carve, love doing the digital design, having the machine do really the heavy lifting, and then I get to do the finishing woodworking. I just find it really rewarding.
Yeah. Can you show everybody your patch? I want you to... Matt made a patch. So if you don't believe him that he's super into this stuff, he's super into this stuff. And I could not be more delighted to share this opportunity with him because he... Basically, we started talking, like January, probably after the holidays, and we were like trying to figure out some ideas. I was like, Matt, why don't you think of some things? Matt did some incredible brainstorming and decided that the coolest thing we could possibly teach people is furniture joinery. It's something that I'm not very good at and have never attempted before in my life. And Matt has a little bit of background in it, and he did some research to a couple different things. And while we were kind of going through this whole process, we're like, okay, one of the coolest things we think we could teach people are 2 joints in particular. The first one being through-hole tenon joints and also clip tenon joints. So both of these kinds of joints are what we consider mortise and tenon joints, mortise being the hole and tenon being like the fingers. And it's one of the strongest joints you could use in furniture building based on some of the research you did, right?
That's true.
So the cool thing is that Matt is very familiar with Illustrator and did a lot of his designing in Illustrator. Adobe Illustrator, for those of you who aren't familiar, is an SVG program. And so we're also going to talk a little bit about SVG imports today, which is something that we've never talked about in Easel before either. So there's a lot of different things we're going to be talking about. But basically, we went from this model here. So this model shows you both the clip tenon joint here, and there's also a clip tenon joint up here. And then we're also going to talk about this one here, just the normal through-hole tenon. And by using those 2 joints, believe it or not, I'm going to have to pick it up. We're going to build these stools. You see this? Look at this thing. So Matt designed these using just these 2 simple joints and also a living hinge. Will you flip the hinge? Check that out. So cool. And just using these 2 joints, I gotta get back on my stool. We're gonna sit through the whole episode too, so don't worry, they're durable. They hold the test of time.
Of course.
So that's what we're gonna do. And it might seem crazy that just 2 joints are gonna be able to help you get to the point where you can build this whole stool, but Matt's done it. And Matt, I want you to kind of talk a little bit about how you landed on this particular project and kind of the research you were doing.
Sure. So I was inspired by this project that we have here that we downloaded from Thingiverse. It had a clip tenon and clipped everything together. And that was sort of part of the inspiration to build a stool, a working stool that could be used, sort of a shop type stool that has some style, but uses no fasteners other than the clips, gravity, and clip tenons. And so that was some of the thinking behind it. I sort of, when I do the design, I sort of force myself to come up with a bunch of different designs. I find that for me, my first design is probably not my best design. I really have to force myself to really iterate. And then one of the things that I looked at was some of the forces and loads that we would be putting on the chair, and took that into consideration as well. One of the other great resources, although we didn't take anything directly from it, is a book by Make, Designed for CNC. It's all about furniture making. And in the book, they have a lot of really good information around designing furniture. One of the things that I think is one of the most interesting things that I took from the book, while we didn't take any direct designs, a lot of concepts we took, they design a lot of their furniture and they name it based on the duration with which you can sit comfortably in that chair. So they have a 30-minute chair, a 60-minute chair. I initially naively thought that meant maybe I could build it in 30 minutes or 60 minutes. Turns out it takes longer than that. But that's how long you can comfortably sit in it. So I believe that we could sit for about 2 hours in these because of the contoured seat while being comfortable.
The Easel Live chair.
Yes.
Hopefully it doesn't take 2 hours, but it's good to know if you need to, we can just sit here forever. Cool. So stools is what you ended up when we were thinking about the actual concept we wanted to build. Mm-hmm. You settled on stools, but where do you start? I mean, you have this idea, but how do you end up getting into the actual design of the stool?
Sure. Well, a stool's never been made before, so I had to basically design it from scratch, the entire concept. No, it turns out stools have been made for a long time. So I sort of, throughout life, I looked online, I looked everywhere around me at home, at work, just sort of throughout life, and I started to take measurements of the seat height. I started to take measurements, which I found about 29 inches seemed to be about the height that I wanted. I looked at the width for the feet to make sure I had the right stability. And again, I was sort of joking earlier, I think some smart people before me have figured out how to make them stable. I also looked at the distance from the seat to where my feet are going to hook on, or my heels rather are going to hook on, and I figured out the distance for that. And I also wanted to have a contour to the seat, and I think we sort of displayed this, but I wanted the seat to come up a bit in the back, so we made a living hinge to make the wood follow that contour. But I found that a bit of a raise in the back of the seat makes it comfortable for me, at least for my lower back. So those are some of the design elements that I wanted to look at. Also, we're here in Chicago, and Venables is headquartered in Chicago, and SPR is in Chicago. And so we thought we wanted to do a Chicago design. So for those of you that aren't in Chicago and may not recognize it, these are sort of elements of the Chicago flag incorporated into the design, and the skyline on the side as well.
I'm gonna get a workout just love it so much. So like I said, even though Matt did use Illustrator to design his stool, we're going to show you how to design those two basic joints that are used on this stool, the only two joints used on this stool. Yep. There's no glue or anything, and Matt wanted to make it so that the living hinge was actually attached with another joint, and I was like, no, like I want to flip it up and down. So we're going to walk through how to do these things in Easel. Now, one thing that's important to talk about before we get into Easel is the material that you're going to use. So as an example, I don't know where your piece went. Oh, it's back there. Hold, please. Okay.
This is live.
This is live. This is there. I've never had so many props for a show. I feel like I'm on an SNL set or something. Okay. So Matt went to Home Depot and bought some big sheets of plywood, right? Sanded plywood?
Yeah, 4x8 sheets of 3/4 inch sanded plywood.
Okay. And that's what this looks like. You can kind of see the plies there. He's got about 6 plies or so of plywood. But the 3/4 inch plywood, the Baltic birch, was what I used when I was designing my prototypes. And you can see like how many more plies there are. Like that's crazy. So that's going to make a huge difference in the flexibility of your pieces. So I was using Matt's design. I carved it out on the same thickness of material. Well, you think that's pine, right? We think it might be pine. Yeah. It's pretty soft. The Baltic birch is a little bit harder, but also because it has more plies, there's a lot more glue. There's a lot more rigidity with the wood that you'll buy on our site. And so that caused some serious issues. So for me, I ended up with pieces that didn't flex, even though Matt's pieces did flex. So like, here's my design, and like absolutely no flexibility with these tenons. But with Matt's design, same one, you get that flexibility. So your material is going to be really important when you're trying to figure out the thickness of what to make these tenons, because otherwise you're going to end up with pieces that won't flex, and then you're not going to be able to get the right tension to get the joint to really stick together well. Now, what I was able to do with my design was I made my arms a little bit thinner, and I was able to get flex. So the designs we're going to show you are kind of our learnings and the things that we kind of figured out along the way with a lot of trial and error. I mean, like there was like a lot of trial and error. So frequently I was carving different size mortises to figure out the right thickness to be able to get the pieces in there, but not too loose, they don't actually grab. And then how far apart are these holes going to be? So there were a lot of factors that went into this, and a lot of learning that went on. I think when we were talking about kind of summaries, one of the most important things that we want people to really understand with this is it's going to kind of take some time to figure out what works best for your machine.
Exactly. Yeah. It's going to be highly dependent on the width of your plywood, which we'll talk a lot about. And it's going to be highly dependent on the type of plies and sort of the flexibility and the dimensions that you cut as well.
Yes. Yep. And so even though we use plywood for all of this, you could use hardwood too. You're feeling really crazy. Just keep in mind though, hardwood, when you're using this, you're going to want to make sure that the tenons go the same direction as the grain, so you can get that flexibility. And you're going to have even different variables to consider with hardwood, just because it tends to be less flexible than the plywood anyway. So every piece of material you use is going to be different. The most important thing you can do is to not give up, stick with it, and just do like a lot of kind of tinkering. And next thing you know, you'll have a stool and be sitting on it whenever you want.
Yeah, and one of the things that, along with tinkering, one of the things that we've been showing you are these small scale, isolated, full size prototypes of the various joints. And these weren't actually developed for us to be able to show here today. These are actually part of the iterative process that we used to come up with a design that we thought looked right. And then we would test it, and maybe we'd find aspects of it that weren't ideal. So we'd go back to the drawing board, tweak it a bit, cut it again, try it again. So that's why we have all these pieces here.
Pieces. Yes, and that's really important too, because some of the things I think you read in your research, they suggested making, like, if you're going to make a chair, make like a smaller model of the chair. We're not necessarily advocating that, because we found it a lot easier to do a partial part of the full size of the joint and test that, rather than have to figure out, okay, now that I know it works, how do I scale it up to the right size? So we found, like, this is obviously not a normal piece of a stool, but I can take this mechanism now and apply that into the part that I know is going to work.
Exactly.
Cool. So that's where we're going to start. So we're going to start with the easier joint first. And this is just going to be the through-hole tenon right here. And basically there's two parts to this, right? So there's the mortise, which is the hole, and then there's the tenon, which is the kind of like the little male nubby part that then goes in. And for Matt's design, he did have a couple different angles that were involved, but we're just going to teach like a straight 90-degree combination joint, because that's just a little bit easier to do in Easel. And especially when you're getting started, it's really important to just kind of understand the concepts for the different components. And then once you get that comfortable with that, you can go crazy. So the actual piece we're going to be doing is just this little guy. And it's just going to show you basically this, and then like its combining hole, which is not this one. I forgot that piece and all my millions of pieces. We're basically just going to be showing this hole and this piece so that you can use that as a guide when you go and make a larger piece. All right, so without further ado, let's jump into Easel and see what we have here. So we're going to start off, like I was talking about earlier, we're going to be using the Baltic birch plywood. And I have my materials right now just set up to 24 by 12, just so you can see what's happening over here. And the material thickness, measure the exact material thickness, because that's really important when you're making those hole thicknesses, to figure out exactly what your material thickness is going to be, because that basically accounts for how wide your hole is going to be. So I've set it to 0.74 inches, which is what I measured my plywood to be. And my machine also has a little bit of play. So this is something that kind of comes into that whole iterative, try to figure out what's going on with your machine that we were talking about. So when I was doing my experiments, I found that I needed to do about 0.06 inches more than the actual material width in order to get a snug fit, but one that I wasn't, you know, having to force in with a mallet or anything like that. So I'm going to start with the rectangle for the hole right now. I'm just going to bring in a square right now. And I'm going to go ahead and set the width of this to 0.8. The reason I'm doing that is, like I said, my material thickness is 0.74. And I've got that play of 0.06. So the hole is going to be 0.8 wide, just to be able to account for the tenon coming into it. Now, the other thing to consider is how high I want my tenon to be. In many of the samples that we did, we were using 1 inch. And we just found that to be a pretty good size in terms of making sure that the tenon was tall enough and provided enough support without being too fragile. So just remember that this is going to be the hole. I'm going to go ahead and set this to outline, and I'm going to make sure the cut is on the inside because I want to make sure I keep that exact dimension when this does carve out. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and start working on the male component, or the tenon itself. And since I'm going to start with just the tenon part, or the part that goes into the mortise, I'm going to make this the same. So this is going to be 0.8 wide, and this is going to be 1 inch tall. And this is just so you can see it, this is going to be the part that goes inside the hole. Now it's a little deceiving because the material thickness, right, is the part that's also counting into this. But the width in this situation, this actually equates to how thick the material is going to be when it comes through the other side. So what does that mean? All right, so if this is my hole, so we know that the width here, right, this is accounting, this is that 0.8, and then this is the 1 inch. And then if this is the tenon that I'm designing, in this case, the width is the same width as our material so that we can figure out now it's going to sit flush when it goes through. Now, if you wanted to get crazy, if you made your width longer than your material thickness, you'd end up with a situation where the tenon kind of sticks out of the mortise, maybe something like that. Or if you wanted it to be hidden, you could also not do a through cut and have it so that, you know, like the tenon only goes partway through, and then you don't see anything on the other side. So those are some things to play around with, but just so you kind of have a sense when you're designing like what we're talking about with these different parts. So we'll go back into Easel, and now what we're going to do is I'm going to add a second rectangle to just kind of again, just for like a little prototyping. So this is going to be what my piece looks like. And to just give myself a little bit of play here, I'm just going to set this to like a 1x3 inch. And I'm going to leave both these pieces as fills. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to align these to make sure that the tenon is in the middle of this piece. And the next thing I'm going to do is align these correctly. So what I'm going to do is use Easel's positioning tools to figure out the best way to coordinate these. So I'll just do this again. I'm going to set in the position tab over here, I'm going to set the bottom left corner to x equals 3. Now you can see that this is lined up with the 3 inch mark. Now for this piece, I'm going to set the lower right corner for the x equals 3. So now I know these two pieces are butted up against each other and all my dimensions remain the same. Now, one thing that we found really helpful while we were designing is before we combined any shapes or did anything super crazy, we always made a copy. And that's because if I have to go back and change this design, it's much easier to be able to pull open the file and still have these two parts separate. But sometimes that messes up your carving, right? Because now I've got to consider something like this. So if I set it to white, I can now just slide it off here. And Easel won't register as that being a carvable element. You can see if I simulate, right, it doesn't even register that this is a part of my design. Now, if I don't set it to white, let's just say I have something like that, then Easel does tell your machine, hey, don't forget to carve this out over here. So it is important if you're going to be using this sort of copy paste and keeping elements to the side, try to keep them in white so that way you can always go back and revise the original one. So now I'll go back, I'll select these components. I've got them aligned still, and they should be all set to go. And now I'm just going to go ahead and combine them. So I can right-click, combine, and now you see I have one element. So the last thing I'm going to do to this shape, I'm going to do an outline cut, and I'm going to set it to the outside. So the reason that that's important is because, like I said, I want to make sure that I keep the full dimensions. If I were to do an inside cut, you can see my actual piece is going to be, since I'm using an 1/8 inch bit, it's going to be a full 1/4 inch shorter than I need it to be. So outside cuts, when you're cutting out these joints, is a really important part. I'm going to make sure it cuts all the way through. And Matt and I talked about this a little bit, but we did find tabs to be incredibly helpful when carving these pieces. The one thing to consider, though, is you don't want a tab on any point that's going to have to be through a mortise. So in this particular situation, like if this tab was here, that could cause some issues, a lot of sanding and cleanup that I might not want to have to deal with. So you can just go ahead, click and drag your tabs. And I just like to keep them off to the side, basically so it doesn't interfere with the tightness that I'm going to get when I bring the two pieces together. All right, so I've got my tenon all set. The last component I'm going to finish here, if you've done any kind of through joinery before, you're probably familiar with what we're going to do next. But right now, if I were to carve these two pieces out, I'll set this to a through just to make it a little bit easier. My pieces are probably not going to fit correctly because even though Easel is telling me that this is a straight right angle, you've always got to account for the radius of your bit that causes a little bit of rounding anywhere there's a corner that is greater than the diameter of your bit. So in this particular instance, I'm going to want to use the dog bone app to make sure that the sharp corners that are cut out from my outside shape are going to be able to fit into the hole. So now you can see with the dog bone generator, I'm able to get little holes here so that the sharp 90-degree corners from my tenon are going to be able to fit into the hole correctly. So now I'm going to do the same thing before. I'm going to save that just in case I have to change something later. And I've got my new piece. I tried using double-sided tape while I was carving these out, and it just wasn't working out that well. So I ended up using just like one little tab off to the side just to keep everything in place and just trying to clean it up as best as I could when I was all set and done. And there you go. That is the basic part of building a through tenon. Now, in a normal situation, you probably wouldn't be carving out the piece that you probably wouldn't be carving out the tenon on the same piece of material where your mortise is going to go in, especially in just a case like this. So you can always duplicate the workpiece and carve them out separately, right? So I could do one workpiece that's just the mortise, and then I could do one workpiece that's just the tenon. So that's something to keep in mind too. But for now, since this is just practice, you can kind of see the two pieces together. So now that you kind of get a sense of what that looks like, just to show you again. So here's the mortise with those dog bone joints on it. And then here's the tenon with no dog bones, but still like that 90-degree. And then you bring it all together and it fits nice and snug. Yep. So this is Matt's. This is why it works so well.
and you can optionally put dog bones. Technically, we should have dog bones at these inside corners as well.
Yes, absolutely. So like Matt was saying, you're still going to have to deal with the radius of the bit on these kind of inside corners too. So dog bones is definitely one way you could handle that. Or you could get like a square file and file that down to make it nice and flush. You got a couple different options with how you want to handle that. But
or get a big mallet.
Or get a big mallet and just go to town on it. It's got a lot of different choices. So that is basically the simplest and yet sturdiest joint I think that you could probably make for building furniture. And it's working because I'm still sitting on a stool. So let it be known. Okay, now we're going to walk you through the clip tenon. And I'm not going to lie, I'm a little nervous to teach this one because this to me, designing this piece in Easel, there are a lot of steps. And I'm not going to try to like shy away from the fact that there are a lot of steps with this, but it is possible and it does work. So for that reason, I'm going to teach it to you. And building this shape, if some of you have watched previous Easel Lives, it's going to be very similar to our ornament episode. And what I mean by that is we're going to have a lot of the pieces while we're building the shape are going to be left as fill shapes. And then at the very end, we're going to combine everything and set to outside outline cut so that we end up with a cutout shape. So while I'm building this, try not to get too confused by the way that the file is looking until the very end, because we're mostly important. The most important things to consider while we're building it are, you know, how thick are our tenon fingers? How do we make sure that these are all the same size to make the mortises easy to design? And then most importantly, like how do we allow enough flex for both our bit to be able to carve this out, but also for the design itself to be flexible while you're using it. So, again, there will be quite a few steps, and I just hope that I can do it all right, but I will mess this up at some point, and I hope that somebody is watching and can correct it. So let's go back into Easel, and I'm just going to go ahead for the sake of simplicity. I'm just going to make a new tab here, and I'm going to start with 2 rectangles, and I'm going to make them 4.5 inches wide and 0.35 inches tall. So these rectangles here are going to be, I've never had a bird fly by the window. I don't sit in a room with windows, but I normally do this. That's so weird. All right, so, and I'm gonna duplicate this, and this is gonna be the 2 finger tenons that have the clips on them. Now I'm also gonna build a second rectangle that will be in the middle, and this one has to be a little bit thicker because this is really where the support comes from. So for this one, it's gonna be the same width, but I'm gonna make it a little bit thicker. In this case, I'm gonna make it 3/4 of an inch thick. So this way, it's a little more stabilizing. And I know Matt really was the one who helped me kind of figure out what I was doing with this because I didn't really know what I was doing. But here's one of the first ones that I did. And you can see that these shoulders here, they're not going to provide a lot of support once this goes through. Because basically, the whole joint relies upon these shoulders to really be what keeps everything in place. Because these clips, right, they're going to be flexible a little bit.
Yep.
But by having the stability of the shoulders is really important for keeping the whole piece together. Yep. So Matt helped me out with that because I didn't know what I was doing. And that's a really good thing to consider while you're building this too, is to make sure that your center one is a little bit thicker than the fingers that you're using too. So the material thickness here is all the same, just to keep things easy. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to align these so they're all nice and happy. And I'm going to set the bottom left position for this one to x equals 1.5 and y equals 1. Oh, wait, sorry, bottom left. Oh, 1. Okay. Now, it might not seem like a really important step to do right now, but I did find it really helpful to use the positioning features in Easel when I was designing this. So now that I've positioned these here, what's important to know is that what I've done is I've enabled the far right side of these to be at x equals 6. So you'll see me use this time and time again while I'm putting this piece together, is always knowing where this part is here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start working in these half circles. So I bring in a circle, and I'm going to lock the dimensions and make it so it's 3/4 of an inch as well. So just 0.75 on either direction. Now, since I want this to be a half circle, I'm going to edit the points. I'm going to delete the point on the left. And then I'm going to use these handles to just kind of straighten that out. So now you see, quick and easy way to get a half circle in Easel. And what I'm going to do is I want it to be in line with this one, right? So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to set the bottom left corner of my half circle here so that x equals 6. And now I know that it's jutting up against this point. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bottom align these so that they stay flush together. And now I know that these two pieces, when they carve out, will look more or less the way that I need them to. There'll be a few more things we're still going to do, but now I know that those are correct. The next thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy and paste that shape, and I'm going to center align it with this component. And similarly, I'm going to make sure that the x coordinate is also at 6, so that those two pieces go together. And then we'll take one more, and we'll move it down here. We'll set the x to 6, and we will make sure to do a top alignment. So now I've basically got the rough starting shape of everything that I need here. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add the shoulders to this center rectangle. I'm sorry. First, we're going to make sure we know how thick the material is so that we can set those shoulders in place. So this is a trick that I use a lot, and I'm hoping that you guys find it helpful. But what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to use a lighter colored square to help me understand where this piece goes once I start figuring out the material thickness that it's going to go into. All right, that didn't make any sense. So let's just show you what I mean. It's one of those hard things to explain. So I'm going to set the height to 6 just so I know enough to deal with. And I'm going to set the width to be the same width as my material thickness. In this case, the 0.74 inches. And now when I lay this over top, I can see that what I'm working with is a way to see when these clips come through the material, what is that going to look like on the other side? And that's important because I want to make sure that there's enough stability on this side of the clip to be able to brace those two things together. So I'm going to set the right side of this practice workpiece to x equals 6. And now I know that this, in an ideal perfect world, that these clips, when they come through the other side, will be right at this point. So that's a good start. And what it does is it's going to enable me to be able to build the shoulders onto this center rectangle. So let's bring another square in. There's going to be a lot of shapes, guys. I wasn't lying to you. And for this one, I'm going to set the height to 1.5 inches because that's like a pretty good stable. You can kind of see, just like as a rough guess here, that's going to add quite a bit of stability to my joint. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to align it. I'm not going to want to select that. I'm going to align all of these pieces together to make sure that they're all in one straight line. Now that I have that, I need to figure out where exactly to position this so that it's close to the right distance for the material thickness. So if you'll remember, my material thickness that I have here is 0.74 inches, and the coordinate that I'm at right now is 6 inches. So where I'm going to move the right side of this piece is I'm going to move it to, wow, it's pretty close. I'm going to move it to 5.26, essentially 6 minus the material thickness. So 6 minus 0.74 is going to give me the right dimension to make sure that this is positioned in the right place. And now that I have all that, I'm going to just extend this backwards just so I can get a sense of like, boom, we're here, we're good. And you can see now if I move my little guide out of the way, we're getting a little bit closer to what we want this to look like. All right, but one thing's a little hard to figure out, and this one took me a little bit of trial and error to figure out because it's important for a few reasons that you get the right distance between these clip tenons. The most frustrating thing that I came up with when I was designing this was that every time I went to combine a shape, these fingers were too close to the center and the bit wouldn't go all the way through. And that was like so frustrating. So I had to figure out a good way to teach this to you guys that hopefully will save you a little bit of frustration. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to check to see what my top coordinate is for this shoulder piece. And in this case, it looks like my Y coordinate is 2.7. That's a nasty number. So let's just go ahead and let's set it to 3. We'll make it a little easier on ourselves. So now I know that my Y coordinate here is 3. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to want to select these components, and I'm going to want to set the lower part of those components also to 3. So basically, now I have these two pieces touching. Fun trick in Easel is if I hold shift on my keyboard and I hit up, hold shift on my keyboard and hit up, it just moved my pieces up 1/8 of an inch. So every time I do that, shift up, 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 it's 1/8 of an inch every time. And that is a standard measurement in Easel. So you can use that when you're trying to position things to hold shift and move it any direction, and it will move it 1/8 of an inch. So like I said, I'm going to move it that way. Now, one important thing to know is this is only the case when I'm in inches. If you're using metric, every time you hold shift and go up, you can see my Y dimension is increasing by 5 millimeters. So a slight difference depending on which measurement you're using. But since we're doing everything in inches, I know now that I've got that 1/8 of an inch. Now that's important because the bit that I'm using is 1/8 of an inch. So I want to ensure that my bit is going to be able to fit in between here when I'm carving. So I'm hoping when I combine everything that Easel will register this as enough space between these elements to allow the bit to get in there. All right, so now we're going to do the same thing on the bottom. I'm going to check my Y coordinate here is 1.5 inches. So I'm going to set the top of this one to 1.5 inches so that they're touching. And then again, I'm just going to do shift and down to move those 1/8 of an inch apart. So now I have that all completed. You guys starting to see? It's starting to look a little bit like what we did, right? I know Matt's impressed. He hasn't seen me done. You haven't seen me do this before, have you?
Not the whole thing.
No, I know. Nothing like the last minute. All right. So the next thing I'm going to do is I want to let me share this real quick. What's a good one? So this is essentially what we have built right now, more or less what we've built. And now I'm going to add in this part and these side parts. Yeah. Oh yeah, I guess I don't have enough hands. We built this part, but we want to add on these supportive parts and these supportive parts. Now. And
those are important because they provide some structure and they hold the joint in place.
Exactly. Yeah, and they are also good because, let's see, we have a bunch of different things here. this one works for now. Like I was saying before, everything we're teaching you and everything that we did is basically a prototype of a larger project. So in these cases, the dimensions I'm using for the additional support here and these parts are sort of negligible in the context of this project because you should adapt those to work however you want for your design.
That's right.
I'm going to show your stool real quick. That's probably a better thing. So you want to point out, like on the clip tenons here?
Sure.
Right?
So, I mean, we can see the fingers right here that we're working on and the centerpiece and the shoulder. And if we look at the side, we can see the basically a through-hole tenon, which is really what that center guy is, and then the clips we can see coming in.
Yeah, so in Matt's particular case, he basically has 2 clips on here, but we're basically just being like, we just want to try and see what this is, right?
That's right. And once you have that, the beauty is it takes some, it's an iterative process to get the joint to be correct and to fit into the mating holes properly. But once you get it, the beauty is that you can start replicating around your design, and all of a sudden you can build really cool stuff very quickly. Very quickly.
So a lot of the dimensions I'm going to work through now, I'll say them out loud to you so you can use them if you want, but just know it's not as vital as kind of thinking about how they might play into the rest of the components that you're doing. So let's go back into Easel. And now that we have this all set up, I'm going to make myself another rectangle here. And this one I'm going to make 4.5 inches wide and just 1 inch tall. I think I meant to have that backwards, actually. I think I wanted this. That seems right. See, I told you guys I was going to do something wrong. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I want to read my directions. What was I doing? Supportive brace, rectangle. Oh, nope, take it back. I wanted it that way. I built it the other way, but now I'm going to build it this way. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to build the upper part of this bracket. So what I want to do is I want to see with my my rectangle. Hold on 1 second. I want to make sure I do this right. Skip something. No, okay. I did it right. I just don't feel like I did it right. All right, so I'm going to check this coordinate here. And I'm going to want to make sure that this is lined up in the same spot as all these other, basically as the X dimension of this piece. So in this case, it's set to 5.26. And I want to make sure that this piece as well is set to X equals 5.26. And now I know that this part is going to align with the brace that is used on the center triangle. And I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate this and do the same thing down here. And now I know that all these pieces are going to align correctly. Now, like I was talking about, I want to make sure I get these 1/8 inch distances correct. So if I look here, my Y component is 3.475. To make things easier, I'm just going to copy and paste that. And then again, I'll use my little shift up trick. And then I'll do the same thing down here. So the bottom Y component here is 1.025. And I'll set the top component here as 1.025. And then lastly, move that down again. So now what I've basically done is I've designed those little side parts so that they're all in line and this whole part of the component will come together correctly. Now, this is what I thought I was doing before. This is why I got all totally fuzzled. So I'm going to leave my width the same, but I'm going to set the overall height to this. I remember from doing this previously, this is basically just this distance here. So if I just go ahead and I'll just position this, like I said, the actual size of this doesn't make a huge difference because what I'm more interested in is what do these pieces look like? Are they spaced enough? And then this part here is really where the bulk of the structure is going to come from for this joint. So the last thing I'm going to do, kind of feigning the dog holes or the dog bones a little bit, I'm going to make a circle. I'm going to set it to white. and I'm just gonna make it slightly bigger than my bit. So in this case, I'm just gonna set it to 1/4 inch. Now these are important, but they're not as super important as some of the other components. So in this case, I'm just kind of eyeball where these go in terms of making sure that they're centered in this white space. But I will make sure that when all is said and done, that they are vertically lined so that they are all in the same spot. So I'll go ahead, I'm just shift clicking to select all of those, and now I've got them all selected. And you can see that I'm just going to put them in a place so that when I go ahead and combine these shapes, that everything is going to be able for the bit to get in there, and they're all in the same spot. So now I've got the piece done, and
Nice.
That's huge. This was a heck of a beast to figure out, and designing this in Easel, by no means, if you build your own, it is a little bit of a struggle. Like I said, there's a lot of steps, so take your time, work through the video, ignore some of the things that I did wrong. But it is possible to build this joint in Easel, as we have just proved. Now, because I might find myself wanting to make changes, maybe I decide that I want to make this a lot longer when I build my final piece or something like that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the entire work piece. So I can do that right here by just duplicating it. And then just to be on the safe side, I'm going to rename this like original. Just so I know later on, I can always reference this and say like, oh yeah, like that's the one where nothing is combined. I'm going to go back into here. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to combine all these to make one shape. And then most importantly, set it to an outside cut.
Can we clap?
No, we can't clap because this is an important part. Because see how my bit is not actually accounting for that entire thing. So if I simulate, it means that it doesn't quite like my distance here. And this does happen in Easel sometimes, where if your dimensions are too close to the actual width of your bit, it's not gonna allow your bit to go in there. So this is one of those cases I can just undo, and undo one last time so that nothing is combined anymore. And I'm just gonna move these just a little bit, give them a little more wiggle room. We'll try one last time. Oh, so close. So this is why we said iterative process, right? Like this is a very much an experimentation in figuring out the various variables. Oh, it really doesn't like that one, does it? Oh, you know what? I moved the wrong part. That's why. I'm going to move all of that down. Nothing like live, folks. I'm telling you. Ta-da! All right, now we can clap. Yay! So, again, if you get into a situation like what we just experienced, just play around with a little bit, because these pieces, these gaps are not necessarily vital, but it is important to make sure that your bit can get in there. So now when I set this to a through cut and I simulate it, I can see that my tool paths are going to go all the way in and be able to cut those out properly. We do feel that using tabs on these parts is really important. Both of us experienced, and Matt, I'm going to let him talk about that a little bit more when we get to the living hinge. But anytime you have pieces like this where they're only attached by a little bit, you're going to get a lot of flex. And I'm just going to kind of position some tabs here to keep those in place so that when I'm carving, I don't have any issues with that.
Yeah, and I also found, I'll share this. I also found that I think the default height for a tab is 0.08 inches. When you're in inches.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that for some of the flexible pieces, and I also sort of cheat and tend to mill slightly beyond my workpiece to make sure I get a clean cut, and don't tell anyone, but my table might not be perfectly flat. So what I found is that sometimes I cut through my tabs, and with these flexible pieces, that's a really big issue. I had a lot of ruined parts along the way. So I found that doubling or quadrupling the tabs, so going to 0.16 or 0.32 for the tab height, worked really well for me.
Perfect. Yeah, and that's good to know. As long as, again, the tabs aren't on places where it's going to impact the structure against the two pieces, right, you'll be able to clean this up just fine. So it is important to keep everything in place when you're carving, because losing those accurate measurements is probably less important than having to do a little bit of cleanup in this particular instance. Okay, so we've got one component here. I promise this next part will be a little bit faster. Less moving pieces, that's for sure. So again, now that I know my material thickness is 0.74, I'm going to start building the holes for these different pieces. I made this project easier on myself, if you remember, by keeping all of these nubs at the same 0.75 inches. So for the holes, just like with the other one, the width of the hole is going to be 0.8. And again, that is because I've got the 0.74 inches for my material thickness, as well as that 0.06 kind of play that I used. And I'm also going to set the height to 0.75. It's important because you want to make sure when you're building this that the hole is able to accept the entire clip. Because what's going to create the tension on this joint is not the sides of the hole itself, but its position relative to where the clip releases. So I've got this, and I'm going to just copy and paste it 3 times because I'm going to have to make 3 of them for my my 3 different components that I have here. So I'm going to go ahead and just make it easier on myself. And what I found is the quickest way to do it is to start with the center one. And I want to make sure that basically this is going to align correctly, just like that. And now that I have those there, I found that when I'm positioning these, I do it so that the flexible part will basically allow it to reach the bottommost part of the hole, or in this case, the topmost part of the hole. And these can be a little bit of guesswork. It helps to keep them as fill shapes just so you can kind of get in here and make sure you're aligning things correctly and keeping everything so that you get that little bit of flexibility. Now, what you don't want to do is align it with like the top of the clip, because when the clip relaxes, it's not going to create any tension on that joint. You want to make sure that you're aligning with, what I've been aligning with is basically either the top of this part or the top of the black line that indicates the gap between them. So this way you have to flex the entire clip down in order to get it through the hole. So what am I talking about? I'm just talking. So in this case, oh yeah, I'll be able to get it out. So in this case, I've got my clips. They kind of come down like this. And in order to get it through the hole here, I can't just press it through, right? There's not enough room for it. I actually have to get them to compress and go into the slot. And then when they release on the other side, that's where the clips kind of come out to the side. And now the joint is relaxed, but it's in the proper place to keep it nice and secure. And you can see, that's like not going anywhere. Yeah. So that's why aligning those holes, kind of as I've shown you, is important, because you want to make sure that you have not necessarily like play in those parts, because the centerpiece is what's keeping everything together. We just want to make sure those clip tenons don't move as much as we possibly can. Okay, so we'll go back into Easel. Guys, longest Easel live of my life. I'm sorry, but I hope it's helpful, because it's a complex operation. So just like before, I'm going to make sure these are all aligned nice and straight, and I'm going to make a copy of them. And then I'm going to set them all to outside cuts. I'm going to use my dog bone app to create those same parts. Oh,
inside.
Well, so it's tricky. Yes, you're right. They do have to be inside. But the dog bone app, since I'm getting new shapes, it imports them anyways. Gotcha. And then I set them to inside. Gotcha. But you are very right. These should always be inside, because you want to make sure that they accept the pieces that are coming into them. So just like last time, I'm going to set these bad boys over here, and I'm going to put them so that the machine doesn't carve them out. Set that to white too. And now I have the 3 holes that will accept those pieces.
Nice.
And that is how you build a clip tenon joint in Easel by some grace of God. I don't know.
That's it?
That's it. That's all it takes. Okay. Just like that. It's that simple. So like we were saying at the very, very beginning of this episode, a million years ago, it's possible to do it in Easel. It doesn't always necessarily mean it's going to be the easiest or the fastest way for someone to produce any part, whether you're 3D carving furniture or some other piece that you're working on. Sometimes it's better to use another tool. And in Matt's case, when he first started designing this, he started using Illustrator. So now that I've shown you how to do this in Easel, we thought it might be kind of fun to show you guys a different program, and also how to take that same part and import it into Easel as an SVG. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt, and he's going to be our little Illustrator expert for the next few minutes.
Excellent. Thank you. Can we start Illustrator on the...
Yes, let's get it rolling here.
And so while we're starting, I will say that I did choose Illustrator for my design because there's a few aspects of Illustrator. Fundamentally, you combine shapes, you remove shapes. Fundamentally, it's the exact same process it was what we just did in Easel. So in a lot of ways, it was no easier for me to do in Illustrator. That's an important point. There are some aspects with the way that I'm able to get in and manipulate things that are already combined. And that's sort of why, knowing that this is a very iterative process, that's one of the reasons that I used Illustrator, because I have access to it and know how to use it. But honestly, it complicates the workflow, and I'm going to actually show you that right now. I think a lot of times as makers and as folks that are using the Inventables software, we find SVGs out there and we want to use an SVG. And so I wanted to walk through. I'm not going to rebuild everything, but I want to walk through the way that we're going to extract this stuff and make a few points along the way.
Excellent. Yes, and I really think Matt does a great job of teaching this because there are things to consider with SVGs, especially when importing them into Easel. And a lot of that has to come down to like inside-outside cuts. Do you want to use a V-bit versus an 1/8 inch bit? So depending on the structure of your design, using an SVG and importing different elements differently makes a huge difference and saves you a ton of time. And you don't have to do masking and Easel and any kind of stuff. So the way Matt did this, I think is just genius. And I'm really excited that he's going to share it with us because it's very, very helpful. So without further ado, the first time we're showing something other than Easel in Easel Live, we are going to show you how to do this in Illustrator.
All right. Well, thanks, Mo. Yeah, so inside of Illustrator, you can see here is the project that I had created originally. And this has all the pieces for the stool. I obviously only have one side because if I flip that, I've got the other side. And the stool calls for 4 rails. There's a short rail and a long rail. And so I can just duplicate those pieces. So when I get into Easel, I'll want to duplicate those. But what I wanted to show was how we might import something like the seat. And this might seem a bit like watching paint dry, but is equally as exciting. But it's actually really important. One point that I want to make is that when you import something, part of an SVG, like this seat, we have an exterior to the seat where we want to make sure that's an outside cut. And you've been sort of driving this point home. But then we have the mortise holes that are dog boned, we could see, especially if we zoom in there. And we want those to be inside cuts. And generally, when you import things into Easel as an SVG import, you're gonna get them as one unit, and I can't change the different ways that I do the cut. So what I'm gonna want to do then is export this in 2 different pieces and then sort of bring it back together in Easel, and I want to show how to do that. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make a copy. I'm going to make sure I've got my selection tool set in Illustrator, and I want to make a and I want to copy this piece. So I'm just going to go up to the menu and say Edit Copy. And now when I save, there's a few different ways I can save. I'm going to advocate you always use File Save As because it always works. There are other ways that don't work, so I'm not going to mention them. And I'm going to do a File New. And what I'm going to do is create a new file in Illustrator. And the type doesn't really matter, but I'll go ahead and pick Print and just pick Letter. And I'll set the dimensions to inches, even though that's not critical now. If you're developing in inches or millimeters, it's a good habit to get into. And then I'm going to go ahead and paste the seat in here. And we have now the seat replicated here. And I meant to not copy the Inventables logo with it. But I need to export the seat exterior and the seat mortises separately. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this Direct Select tool. For those of you familiar with Illustrator, you're very familiar with this. And I'm going to click on one of the mortises. And then I'm going to go ahead and shift click and click on one of the other mortises. And I think I had everything selected. Let me try that again. I'm going to click on the first mortise, and then I'm going to go ahead and shift click to get the second one. And then I'm going to go ahead and say Edit Cut. What that does is expand my selection, and I'm going to say Edit Cut again. And now what I have is my seat minus the mortise. This is what I want the exterior cut to be. So I'm just going to simply say File Save As. And I'm going to pick the location of Easel Live, and I'm going to call this Seat. And I'm going to change its type to SVG. I'm going to go ahead and hit Save. Now, a second dialog comes up, and there's two things I want to point out. We want to make sure we're SVG 1.1. We want to make sure responsive is not selected. I think that is set by default. Responsive basically means that's equivalent to please resize me. We've spent so much time in Illustrator getting this thing to be exactly correct dimensionally. The last thing we want to do is have it get resized in this process. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK, and that file has just been written out to the hard drive. I want to do one more thing. And the reason I'm creating a new file again is that everything gets saved in whatever file I'm in as the SVG, and I want these to be separate. So I'm going to go ahead and create another blank document again. Doesn't matter the type. I'll say letter. And I'm going to go ahead and hit paste. Well, what's in my buffer? The mortises are still in my buffer, which is incredibly convenient because I want to save these separate.
It's almost like you planned it that way.
It is almost as if that was planned. And yes. So I'm going to go ahead and say file save as again. Same thing we did before. I'm going to call this seat mortise. Did I spell that correctly? I want to make sure that the type is SVG, and I'm going to hit save. I'll get the other dialog that comes up and check that it's 1.1 and responsive is not selected, and I'll say OK. So now both of those are out there. So now what we want to do is let's go back to Easel.
So we'll go back to Easel. We switched seats on you guys. Getting confusing. So we'll pull open the Easel window.
Alrighty. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now go ahead and I'm just going to create a new project so we don't
ruin my beautiful work.
That's
my
correct.
Life's work.
And
oh, let's just do a new workpiece maybe.
Okay, perfect. I think I hit the wrong thing. Thank you. So we have a new workpiece here. So what I'm going to go ahead, and I'm sure many have done this, go ahead and select import and pick SVG. I'm going to navigate, and I'm going to bring in the seat and say open. And sure enough, there it is, just like we would expect. And I'm going to go ahead and change its depth to the maximum. Here we've got a 0.74. That's wonderful. And then I want the cut to be outside because I want to maintain those dimensions. Now I'm halfway done. Next, I want to go back to import and say SVG again. And this time bring in the seat mortise, say OK, or open. And now we can see that this came in. What I'm going to want to do is change that also to be the maximum depth. And then for this, I'm going to go ahead and right click and say combine. And after I do that, I can select the cut. And this I want to be interior. And then I'm not going to take you through the process, but what I could do is very carefully line this up. For now, I'll just select them all and make sure that it's centered.
Perfect.
And that's one way that you can import files into Easel. And the main thing that we displayed here is that if you want to bring pieces in and have an inside versus an outside cut, which is incredibly important to the joints that we're talking about here today, you need to bring them in separately. You could also just design it in Easel and skip all this complexity, which was one of the points that I had started with. One other thing that I want to show if we have time, because I think this is one of the shorter Easel lives, if I'm not mistaken, is if I create a new workpiece, I want to show in Illustrator.
Let's go to Illustrator. Never had to switch applications before, you guys. You're so patient. So now we'll go to Illustrator.
And I'm going to go ahead and go back to our original project. And inside of here, I have a little gem. I have some text in here. And so one of the things that I find that there's a lot of confusion and good information, also misinformation, is how do I import text via, as an SVG into Easel? I see this all the time. And I just want to show people that if I click in here, I can actually type. This is actual live text. There's no smoke and mirrors going on here. So what I want to do is go ahead and make sure that I've got the selection tool and I want to select it. And there are two things that I need to do before I can export this as an SVG. The first thing that I want to do is go to the object menu and pick expand. I want to make sure that object and fill are selected and say OK. Now I've just converted that, as you know, well, Mo, from actual font to a bunch of objects. But we're not done. If we export at this point to SVG, we can sometimes see some odd things happen which aren't good. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to combine these using the Pathfinder tool. So I'm going to go to Window and Pathfinder to find that window. And then this first top left item here is Unite. I'm going to go ahead and click that. And what that has done is that has further changed this to be united, a bunch of objects that are now united. If I go back to my selection tool, I can select that. I'm going to copy it, and you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to say File New, so I can isolate this. I'm going to create a new letter, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it just like we did before. I'm going to say file save as, like we've done before. I'm going to call this text. I'm going to save that as type SVG like we did before and hit save. And I want to double check SVG11 and responsive is not set and say, okay, now that's been written out. So if we navigate back to Easel, we could bring that into a new workpiece.
So we'll go into Easel. We'll finish this up strong.
Thank you. So in this new workpiece here, we're going to do exactly what everyone is thinking right now. We're going to say import SVG. We're going to go ahead and pick the text. I'm going to say open, and there it is. Now, because it's all these separate pieces, I would probably just combine it for convenience so I can move it around, and there you have it.
Voila.
Text has been imported.
And you'll see, since we're still using the 1/8" bit, this isn't really showing up as much of anything, which is why using something like a V-bit in this particular instance to get that clean text, nice and curvy and beautiful. V-bits are definitely the way to go with text in a lot of situations, but especially in instances where it's this complex. And look at that. It looks so good. So everybody just got so much knowledge today. I don't even know if we are ever going to be able to teach somebody more than what we just taught them today. I did want to show, because we didn't get a chance to go over living hinges, and I have a feeling there might be some questions about that, because the living hinge is a really cool component that you can do with an X-carve or even a Carvey. And I wanted you to just spend a minute talking about kind of what you went through when you were designing your living hinge and some of the things that you considered.
Sure.
Because I know, maybe start with this little guy here.
Yeah, sure. So I did some research on some various living hinges, and then I started to experiment, which is always a good way to go. And so I came up with about 3/4 inch slots, 3/4 inch pieces with about an 1/8 inch gap in between. And this actually is a failed piece, by the way, that Mo graciously handed me, which I'll get back to. But what I did was I took a guess at what I thought would be what I'd need in order for the hinge to flex. And then I went ahead and ran some prototypes and then saw how they bent. And this worked out really well. I do want to reiterate a point that Mo made earlier, that tabs are incredibly important when you have pieces that are very flexible. Because what happens is when you get close to being done carving, it's easy for the bit to start wandering, the piece start to compress, and it happens at the very end after you've invested a few hours into the carving. And I had a few pieces get ruined, not just the living hinge, but other fingers on the clip tenon as well. Mm-hmm. So that's where, I'm strongly recommending really deep, sort of extra deep tabs to make sure you can hold those pieces in place.
Yeah, and you can see them on this piece, which is working. You can see like he's using a lot of tabs like very frequently in like a part of the piece that's probably going to lose a lot of flexibility, or have a lot of flexibility when you're carving, because you lose that rigidity of being attached to the whole unit, right? And it's a little bit harder to see here, but these tabs are pretty thick too. I think you said you were going about an 1/8 inch.
Yeah,
more.
Roughly.
Yeah, so that really makes sure that while you're carving, this thing isn't doing what it does so well and moves all over the place, and it really keeps it sturdy so that you don't end up in a situation where you're almost done carving and then suddenly everything like falls apart, which is so frustrating.
Yes.
Well, I think we hopefully covered everything we wanted to talk about. I did want to really extend my sincerest gratitude to you, Matt, because this entire project, everything that I've learned, everything that we just tortured these poor people with learning, it could not have happened without you doing all this experimentation and doing all this trial and error. And it has just been an absolutely incredible experience doing this with you.
It's been a ton of fun.
It has been a ton of fun. So I know everyone has hopefully been in the chat. I know Maura has been helping out with us with doing the chat. If you guys have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us at help@inventables.com. We also have a lot of resources that we use while we were designing this. And while we didn't get a chance to get all of those into the video description right now, we will put those in there very, very shortly. They include a link to the book that Matt shared earlier, the Thingiverse website. We talk a little bit about opendesk.cc, which is where you can find a ton of open design furniture. Yep. You use that, I know, for quite a bit of your things. And just more information around digital joints in general that could hopefully help you as you start moving away from these easier load-bearing joints to maybe things that are more complex, that are hidden, and like all kinds of weird stuff. Is there anything else you want to add at all?
No, thank you. And thank for everyone. If you did stick around, thank you for sticking around.
Yes, and we have a little crowd gathered here too. So thank you, crowd.
Yes.
It was wonderful. Yay! All right, so thank you everyone for watching. We're also add in timestamps so that you can get to the parts that are worth learning about after the video is done. Again, feel free to reach out to us at help@inventables.com if you have any other questions about anything. And hopefully we will see you at the next Easel Live. Bye.